On the evening of May 31, 2009, an Air France Airbus A330, carrying 228 individuals, was conducting a routine flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. While traversing a storm updraft over the expansive Atlantic Ocean, the aircraft encountered ice crystals that infiltrated its pitot tubes, leading to significant disruptions in various flight control and protection systems, as well as inaccuracies in flight parameter readings. This malfunction resulted in confusion among the pilots, ultimately causing the aircraft to enter a harrowing freefall. This incident marks the tragic narrative of Air France Flight 447. The flight was scheduled to depart from Gale International Airport in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and was bound for the well-known Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France. The journey was expected to last approximately 12 hours, with passengers set to arrive at their destination the following morning. The aircraft assigned to this flight was a 4-year-old Airbus A330-200, identified by serial number 660 and registration code FGZCP. It had been delivered to Air France in April 2005 and had logged nearly 19,000 flight hours. The captain of the flight, 58-year-old Marc Dubois, was an experienced pilot with nearly 11,000 flying hours, over half of which were as a captain, including approximately 1,700 hours on the Airbus A330. He was accompanied by his first officer, 32-year-old Pierre Cédric Bonin, who had amassed less than 3,000 flight hours, with only about 87 of those on the A330, following the total time spent on pre-flight preparations and the flight itself. The duration of the flight exceeded the 10 consecutive hour threshold established by Air France for its pilots. Consequently, a 3-pilot crew was assigned to Flight 447, with the 2 primary pilots being supported by a 3rd relief first officer, 37-year-old David Robert. He brought with him approximately 6,500 flight hours, making him the most seasoned A330 pilot in the cockpit, having logged nearly 4,500 hours on that aircraft type. The 3 pilots were accompanied by 9 additional crew members to attend to the needs of the 26 passengers on board, the majority of whom were French, German, or Brazilian nationals, many of whom were connecting to other flights upon arrival in Paris. With a total of 228 individuals on the aircraft, the A330-200 was nearly at full capacity, necessitating meticulous attention to all pre-flight procedures. The aircraft's condition was also scrutinized, as it had recently undergone a significant overhaul following a prior accident, which had only been completed a few weeks earlier. Just before 8:30 p.m. Flight 447 received clearance to begin taxiing down the runway, and at 7:29 p.m. Brazilian Standard Time, 10:30 p.m. UTC, the fully loaded Airbus took off, commencing its half-day transatlantic journey to France. As the aircraft ascended to 20,000 feet, the relief first officer was released for his 3-hour break in accordance with Air France's flight protocols, with the captain scheduled to take the subsequent 3-hour break, followed by the first officer. Flight 447 proceeded without incident until it entered oceanic airspace at approximately 1:55. At 1:08 m UTC on June 1 ST, the occupants encountered the typical storms that frequently develop in the equatorial region, which significantly intersected their flight path. While these converging storms are generally manageable, they can pose challenges for pilots due to the unreliable weather radar representations of their intensity, particularly during nighttime. Moments prior, the relief first officer had returned from his rest period to assume control from the captain, who briefed him on the turbulence ahead. The captain did not provide guidance on navigating through it, leaving the primary first officer to direct his colleague, with whom he would be flying for the next 3 hours. The flight crew attempted to avoid the storms by climbing to an altitude of 37,000 feet, however, as it was the onset of summer, the warm weather and thin air conditions hindered the Airbus A330's ability to reach their desired altitude. Acknowledging the necessity to navigate through the turbulent area, the pilots activated the aircraft's landing lights. Fortunately, the turbulence was less severe than initially anticipated, yet storms still loomed ahead, prompting the pilots to maneuver leftward to evade them. In their efforts to circumvent these storms, they encountered an additional issue: a flurry of ice particles at the tops of the storm clouds, propelled by updrafts, began to impact the A330's fuselage, with some particles infiltrating each of the 3 pitot tubes, which are essential for measuring incoming air pressure. The assessment of various critical flight parameters revealed that the pitot tubes, equipped with heaters to mitigate ice formation, became obstructed due to an exceptionally high concentration of ice particles. This blockage hindered airflow, resulting in a significant drop in the atmospheric pressure readings. Consequently, the readings from the pitot tubes were compromised, leading to erroneous data being displayed on several aircraft computers, particularly a drastic reduction in airspeed. The aircraft, which was originally traveling at approximately 275 knots, registered a mere 139 knots. Additionally, the autopilot system disengaged, the flight director indicators vanished, and the flight control mode transitioned from normal to alternate. Many of the aircraft's automatic protection systems, including stall protection, were deactivated, which increased the aircraft's sensitivity to roll inputs. The first officer was required to manually control the aircraft, as the auto thrust system was also disabled. This resulted in the aircraft banking sharply with each roll input made by the first officer. To exacerbate the situation, the pitch angle and vertical speed escalated to levels that triggered the stall warning. The first officer faced considerable challenges in stabilizing the aircraft's fluctuating bank angles, ultimately managing to regain control and silence the stall warning. However, this momentary relief was fleeting, as the airspeed readings once again became erratic, plummeting to as low as 73 knots, nearly 200 knots below the actual speed. The A330 subsequently began to pitch up sharply, accompanied by an alarming vertical airspeed. The situation escalated beyond the previous instance, with the aircraft now ascending at a rate of 6,000 feet per minute while its nose was elevated at an approximate angle of 11 degrees. This development perplexed the first officer, whose attempts to rectify the situation only exacerbated the problem. Soon, the stall warning re-emerged, and within moments, the aircraft reached its critical angle of attack, leading to aerodynamic difficulties. Prior to this, the pilots in the cockpit had attempted to reach their captain, who was in the rest area, in hopes of his assistance. The first officer continued to make nose-up inputs and adjusted the thrust-to-takeoff power while striving to manage the aircraft's roll to maintain altitude. By this time, the ice in the A330's pitot tubes had melted, resulting in accurate readings from all airspeed indicators. The autopilot had also re-engaged. However, this development was not a cause for relief. Instead, the correctly calibrated airspeed indicators raised significant concerns, as they indicated the aircraft was traveling at 180 knots, nearly 80 knots below the necessary speed to sustain an altitude of over 35,000 feet. Despite this inadequate airspeed, the aircraft inexplicably climbed to nearly 38,000 feet in under a minute and a half, with an angle of attack of approximately 40 degrees. The autopilot subsequently disconnected again as the climb commenced, and the aircraft began to bank sharply to the right. The time was 2:11 a.m. At this juncture, the captain had not yet returned to the cockpit, placing immense pressure on the first officer to regain control of the aircraft. This task proved to be exceedingly challenging. The relief officer was present, providing assistance as they endeavored to initiate a rapid descent to a safer altitude. Despite achieving a descent rate of approximately 10,000 feet per minute, the severe fluctuations in the pitching angle hindered the pilot's ability to navigate through the tumultuous conditions. Desperately in need of assistance, the captain re-entered the cockpit moments later. However, his return would not suffice to avert disaster. Upon resuming his duties after a brief respite, the captain was alarmed to observe that the indicated airspeed on the flight displays was a mere 60 knots, rendering the angle of attack sensors ineffective and silencing the storm warnings. Just when it seemed the situation could not deteriorate further, the indicated airspeed continued to plummet at an altitude and flight position where aircraft typically maintain speeds exceeding 200 knots. The displays for Flight 447 alarmingly showed an airspeed drop below 30 knots. Compounding the crisis, the aircraft's rightward bank was now tilting at an angle of up to 45 degrees, despite the first officer fully deflecting his side stick to the left. Passengers, concerned about the unusual movements of the plane, remained unaware of the perilous situation unfolding around them. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, there was a palpable sense of urgency. The situation was characterized by overwhelming confusion and a genuine apprehension that regaining total control of the aircraft might be impossible. The pilots explored every possible option to stabilize their plane. They attempted to move the thrust levers to idle in an effort to lower the aircraft's nose and decrease the angle of attack. However, this action yielded only minimal results. Despite recalibrating the airspeed indication, the first officer speculated that the altitude gain could have resulted from the aircraft exceeding its speed limit, prompting him to deploy the speed brakes. This maneuver, however, caused the aircraft to pitch upwards. The more seasoned relief officer disagreed with this assessment and directed the first officer to retract the levers, which resulted in the aircraft's nose pitching downwards and then back upwards again. Despite their concerted efforts, the aircraft continued its rapid descent. A brief moment of optimism emerged when the aircraft managed to achieve a level heading, but this was short-lived. The pilots struggled to control their sidestick controllers against the aircraft's yaw motion. Within minutes, Flight 447 found itself at an altitude of 10,000 feet and still descending rapidly. The cockpit atmosphere became increasingly frantic, and the relief officer inquired whether restarting the flight control computers might prove beneficial. Although the captain initially responded negatively, he proceeded to reset both the primary and secondary flight controls, leading to further confusion as the pilots faced the critical decision-making process. The urgent need for the aircraft to ascend was complicated by the stressful circumstances, which resulted in both the first officer and the relief first officer exhibiting indecision regarding their subsequent actions. Their conflicting maneuvers with the side sticks triggered multiple dual input warnings from the flight computers, while the aircraft continued its descent. Time was rapidly depleting for the pilots, who were nearing an altitude of 2,500 feet, as indicated by the ground proximity warning sensor. At this juncture, they collectively determined that elevating the aircraft's nose was the most prudent course of action. Unfortunately, this decision came too late, and despite a peculiar last-minute attempt by the first officer to assume full control of the aircraft, Air France Flight 447 was descending too rapidly to recover from the stall. At approximately 2:15 a.m. on June 1, 2009, just 3 hours and 45 minutes after takeoff, the Airbus A330 tragically collided with the ocean, resulting in the loss of all 228 lives on board. Following several minutes without any confirmation of the flight status, it became evident to the nearest control towers monitoring the flight that a grave incident had occurred, necessitating an investigation. However, the circumstances surrounding Flight 447 complicated this process, as the aircraft appeared to have disappeared without a trace. Control towers in Brazil and Senegal promptly alerted search and rescue services, yet they faced the challenge of not knowing the aircraft's potential crash site due to minimal radar coverage and a lack of witnesses in the suspected area. The disappearance of Flight 447 remained a mystery for nearly 2 days until evidence of its fate emerged. A Brazilian aircraft discovered debris floating in the ocean, and shortly thereafter, some bodies and personal belongings of the victims were recovered. However, it was not until April 3, 2011, nearly 2 years later, that the majority of the aircraft's wreckage was located at a depth of approximately 12,000 feet beneath the ocean's surface. In the following weeks, investigation teams and law enforcement worked diligently to gather as much evidence as possible from the site. Fortunately, both black boxes were successfully located and sent to the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BA, the French Air Safety Agency, for analysis. The examination of the data took over a year, and in July 2012, the BA released a report detailing the circumstances surrounding Air France Flight 447. The report revealed that the airspeed indicators malfunctioned due to ice crystals obstructing the A330's pitot tubes, which led to the disconnection of the autopilot. This transition resulted in the flight control mode shifting to alternate law, deactivating the aircraft's protection systems against dangerous angles of attack, bank angles, and overspeed commands. The flight crew was held accountable for their improper control inputs, which destabilized the flight path, as well as for their failure to recognize and respond promptly to the numerous warning signs that indicated a critical situation had developed. According to the report, the crew did not connect the loss of airspeed indicators with the ensuing complications. The indicated airspeed and the appropriate procedures were not communicated in a timely manner, resulting in a failure to report deviations from the original flight path. Additionally, the crew did not recognize the stall warning or their strategy to address the aircraft stall condition, both of which were critical pieces of information that could have facilitated recovery. The report determined, based on the available training records, that neither the first officer nor the relief first officer had received training in manual aircraft handling during stall approaches and stall recovery at high altitudes. The findings of the investigation are expected to aid in the formulation of aviation protocols following the tragic outcome of Flight 447. The Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis, BA, recommended a review of the content of check and training programs by the European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, to ensure that regular exercises focused on manual aircraft handling, stall approaches, and stall recovery at high altitudes become mandatory. Furthermore, the BA advised the aviation authorities to mandate that aircraft engaged in public passenger transport be equipped with an image recorder capable of capturing the entire instrument panel, with strict regulations governing the retrieval of such recordings to maintain confidentiality. The EASA was also requested to establish additional criteria for access to the role of relief captain to enhance task-sharing synergy among augmented crews. Lastly, the installation of a directly accessible angle of attack indicator in the cockpit was recommended to the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. The incidents involving Flight 447 serve as a critical reminder of the potential consequences when flight crews are inadequately prepared for unexpected situations. Circumstances, however, putting the blame solely on the pilots would be wrong, because in such a stressful and unexpected situation even the most experienced pilots can make poor decisions. What do you think about the fate of Flight 447? Please share your thoughts in the comments.